Hello, very beautiful community. We're going to try to look at something I was very skeptical about looking, which is the interview that the Russian billionaire Melnichenko gave to Tucker Carlson. And the reason we're going to talk about it is I think there's actually a lot of juice for us here. I was skeptical, but a few of you wrote in to me, asked me to have a look at the interview, and I decided on balance, actually, it would be worth our time discussing it. I hope to bring this out earlier, but as ever, for health reasons, I'm only ready to chat with you by the latter stages of the day, so some of you might be catching this on Monday. What's the point of talking about this Russian dude that Tucker Carlson interviews? I think one point for us, and we'll throw in plenty of quotes from the interview and from another interview of this Russian billionaire Melnichenko, is to make ourselves, because we are the beautiful community, to make ourselves more ideologically beautiful. And when we try to make ourselves more ideologically beautiful, we don't do the obvious lazy move, which is to tell other people in the world, snap out of your ideology, it's silly, and come over to mine. That is not good. What's good is always for others to find resources within their own ideologies to express those ideologies more constructively and less destructively. That is even true for the F-word ideology. So one of the worst things that happens to humans is that they're completely ideologically enclosed. And that doesn't mean that they are grumpy and in a fighty mood, in a fighty stance toward everybody else's ideology. What it means is that they are so claustrophobic that they're in the ideology the way you are in a house, the way you are in a room in the house, the way you are in a room in the house with the door locked, with the lights turned off, and you're then in a cupboard, right? So this complete catastrophic loss of wherewithal of your own ideology and how it stands to things that motivate human beings, how it stands to various kinds of local and universal human values. So it's about getting out of a box. And in this light, looking at this really shocking and extreme set of views expressed by this Russian billionaire who thinks he is free of ideology, but is profoundly ideological, is useful to us. Now, some of you may say to me, it's 2% of you that say this to me, don't do that. Don't talk about Tucker Carlson and don't talk about anything destructively populist and anything suspiciously fascistized, because we don't hear it. You're giving air to it, giving oxygen to bad things. Let's focus on good things, like sunflowers, which I love. I love sunflowers. But that request, lovingly, I'm going to have to reject, because in ideological terms, that request is the equivalent of saying, I want my mum. But I'm trying to lovingly be a public intellectual, a minor public intellectual, but I'm not your mum. I'm just not. And not being your mum, I can't protect you from conflict to which you should be exposed in the social world you find yourself in. And conflict which you should enter into constructively, right? Being able to engage in conflict effectively. One of the things I moan about the most when it comes to the current state of the universities in the West is that over the last 20 years, we've stopped giving undergraduates, just do one degree. Of course, this is true about all students, postgraduate students, but especially the undergrad degree is what worries me here, because it's such a central pillar of liberal democracy in small l, small d sense, that if you lose it as a democratic pillar, you're in trouble. And you lose it as a democratic pillar to some extent if you pump out students into society who can't any longer engage in conflict constructively, and they often end up saying, don't show me badnesses, right? But when you go like that, it's not true that the world has gone, the bad parts of the world have gone away. You've just stopped looking at them. Now, telling off over. The first reason I want to talk about this dude is how ideological he is. If you read the comments underneath Tucker's interview, if you read the YouTube comments under Tucker's interview with Melnichenko, the comments are extremely directed to the supposed pragmatism, skepticism, and indeed cynicism of this guy. It just seems to a lot of people like what he's saying is, well, the world's bad. It's a sort of free-for-all. It's a sort of war of all against all. What can you do? We must get by. Nobody is guilty or innocent. You just have to look after your own patch and make sure that your own patch doesn't get attacked. And this guy freaks out apocalyptically in an ethical way when it comes to his patch being attacked. But the rest of the world is not just regrettably, but even in a normatively impeccable way to be thought of as a free-for-all, a war of all against all. So this is somebody who is not, seeing the house that they are in. And part of the specific way we'll deal with ideology in this chat, looking at this interview, is by reflecting on how far money, and power can become actually ideological center points of their own accord. Let us have a look at where we go now, and that is the interview itself. Now, small point about Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is an algorithmic, insert your own word. Let's be mild here and call him an algorithmic personality. That's not to say that Tucker's sitting around lying, but it is to say that Tucker walks around thinking things that it is algorithmically convenient for him to think. Melnichenko quotes from the Tucker interview. Quote, I have absolutely nothing to do with the invasion of Ukraine. When Tucker asks him about personal sanctions, he says, I consider myself a collateral damage of the biggest conflict. I don't think it was anything personal. So this guy has a whole bunch of assets in the West seized. And what I want to put aside here is, for another time, a political conversation about who you sanction, who you don't sanction, the upside of sanctions, the downside of sanctions, this sort of paradox of there being, on the one hand, irresistibly compelling arguments to sanction various kinds of Russian so-called oligarchs. There aren't oligarchs in Russia. But on the other hand, it being also the case that us doing that draws them closer to the Putin regime and consolidates the Putin regime. The reason there aren't any oligarchs in Russia today, while there were in the 90s, is that the cartoonish sense I use for that term is having so much economic power that you have political power. But people who have a lot of economic power and wealth in Russia don't have political power as a result of that. In fact, as a result of that, they are slavishly subservient to the regime. You don't get to tell Putin anything just because you've got a lot of money. And there was a segment of Western policy making that fell for this straightforward illusion that there was some kind of oligarchy that could pressure Putin. That was an elementary misunderstanding of how the regime works. Tucker asks Melnichenko, you don't seem mad about it. Melnichenko says, how can you be mad about something you can't control? it's like being mad at the rain. It'll pass. So there is indeed a sort of Zen quality but to Melnichenko, but there is deep ideology infusing everything that I'm quoting, and I'll illuminate how that's the case afterwards. Half of the interview is actually about the climate crisis. And of course, Melnichenko must be an expert on the climate crisis because he works in the coal industry. Something that I may have skipped some small sections of the long interview, I confess. But in the bits that I heard, there was plenty of talk about Melnichenko being in the fertilizer industry. I didn't hear much talk about him being in the coal industry. This was also slightly embarrassing for Tucker, because Melnichenko, at least at the level of climate science, was paradoxically less of a denier than Tucker is, and Tucker didn't like that. But here is Melnichenko on the climate crisis. This is not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the Putin regime and ideology, but it's part of the thing we're trying to pick at. What's wrong, this is Melnichenko, is that from these facts, which in part include the facts of climate science, we're jumping to the conclusion and starting to discuss who is guilty. And it's always the same circle that we're in. Firstly, there exists a sin. Somebody has to have done something bad. Then there exists a punishment. Something bad happens because somebody has done a sin. Then you have to recognize your sin, and then after, you can be welcomed back into paradise. Instead of asking how to deal with the problem, you start to think how to deal with the person who caused the problem. You see, this highly intelligent man. And that, I think, he says, is the problem. Now, I won't legislate this in our chat here, but obviously there was an absolutely egregious campaign of media manipulation and lobbying and corrupting of political institutions by bits of the fossil fuel industry over decades, starting in the 80s, whereby they fully well knew, in fact knew better than anybody else in the world, the impact of the climate crisis, and chose to try to fudge this, chose to do everything they could politically to obscure a truth which they knew, a truth the magnitude of which they knew. And I don't always agree with what Al Gore says, but when Al Gore calls that the biggest crime since the Second World War, if Al Gore means in the West, then I agree. What I want to do now, because Tucker's interview was so poor and isn't in any way journalistic, I want to jump to the interview Max Seddon did for the FT with Melnichenko just a few months earlier, I think in late 2023 in Dubai. Quoting again, "Life is complicated. Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky is responsible for the war because, this is when the quote begins, because he made it a goal of his election campaign to avoid the war, but provoked his strong aggressive neighbor into doing it through his extreme unprofessionalism." And the same goes for the United States with their leaks about the Russian invasion, which were intended to stop the war, but they failed. Melnichenko concludes that means the United States did their job badly and couldn't achieve the outcome they wanted. That's to say, avoiding the war. So responsibility here is collective, Melnichenko says. Max Seddon asks him if he feels any guilt for the war. Melnichenko answers, "I absolutely don't consider myself personally responsible for the tragedies that have happened." He says, insisting that the fault lies with world leaders. this is a very important quote coming up, trying to work out who is guilty and not guilty is very dangerous. Trying to work out who is guilty and not guilty is very dangerous. Worried that we're talking about in cross purposes, Max Seddon says, I asked Melnichenko if he resents the West for sanctioning him. And a few months after sanctioning him, sanctioning his wife, after she became the beneficiary of the trust that owns his assets, he shrugs it off. Quote, it's like any natural disaster, a rain, a hurricane. What can you do? It is what it is. Melnichenko, Max Seddon writes, is more animated about the broader consequences of the sanctions against him that have become part of a global tug of war over grain exports from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Melnichenko likens these sanctions, which he says have driven up global food prices and precipitated a hunger crisis in poor countries, to the US nuclear bombing of Hiroshima. Quote, it didn't hit many military targets, the war's outcome had already been determined, and the suffering is enormous. It's exactly the same. If you're harming millions who have nothing to do with the conflict, you're a war criminal. Don't hide behind the term collateral damage. It's a crime. It doesn't matter why you did it. So, Putin's invasion of Ukraine and everything in global politics and global economics is about nobody being guilty. It's about this kind of free-for-all. The purposes of the agents involved, you sometimes understand better, sometimes less well, but that's just what it is. It is what it is. That is what it is. And you can't really say anything about it, except that you hope it stops. And it's all murky, like some kind of a business deal that's gone wrong. The invasion of Ukraine is some kind of a business deal between Russia and the West that's gone wrong. But there is one thing you can assess and object to ethically, and that is when people come for your turf. Now, admittedly, Melnichenko is not talking about his own suffering, the fact that he is now stuck with a $300 million yacht apparently in his possession, while his $600 million yacht is arrested in Trieste. Now, forgive me if these details are not correct. It's not critical to this video, but that's my understanding as of the recording. Now, that's not what he's complaining about, but the secondary effects of the sanctions on him, Melnichenko says, are Hiroshima. All the global politics around him is stuff you can't assess. Nobody's guilty. It is what it is. But when you come for his stuff, it's Hiroshima. And the wonderful Russian political philosopher who I'm going to mention later in our chat, Greg Yudin, in his last round of public talks, was keen to point to this FT interview as this extreme example of neoliberalism, whereby the world is a political and ethical free-for-all. You can't say anything about that, but as soon as your stuff is attacked, it's Hiroshima. It's pointless to talk about good and evil, I'm quoting Melnichenko, because it all depends on where you're looking at it from. This is a time when the masks are off and everyone is going wild. It's pointless to talk about good and evil because it all depends where you're looking from. But when it comes to your stuff, that's Hiroshima. So why is any of this interesting? The key thing that's interesting here is the extraordinarily deep ideological wash that swims around in this man's head, which he doesn't realize. In some ways, he's victimized by his own intelligence in other domains, and that obstructs him from recognizing this. There is, of course, something quite straightforward, which is ideology in a negative sense. That is to say, political views that are products of various power relations, which distort political views, and you then say that these views are not views that have been arrived at in the way that we find acceptable, because they are quite transparently victims of various power relations that have distorted them. And that's not the central point I'm going to emphasize in this talk, but it's an important thing to place. There are some positive conceptions of ideology, but there is this negative conception of ideology. And that's to say that Melnichenko thinks stuff he thinks because of various power relations around him. They are what have produced this outlook on the world. A minor example that's quite reasonable of the same phenomena that we gave a few times is somebody who is pro-climate in a way that is conditioned by the propaganda of the fossil fuel industry, and so is focused on recycling, not on fundamental political change. And you might wonder if in each given case, it might not be the case in some cases, but you might wonder if in each given case it is true that somebody purely focusing on individual responsibility is in fact taking a position that is a product of this enormous campaign of corruption of the US political system by the fossil fuel industry in the 80s. Details here don't matter. I'm just illustrating the structure of the example. So, what kind of ideology are we talking about here? We're talking about ideology that is somehow to do with power and money being at the center of ideology, and not just being cynical ways of going around the world, which are non-ideological. So let's take 3 propositions. Centering money and power is not ideological. You know, Ricky isn't ideological, he's just obsessed with money and power. Second proposition, and this is the sense of negative ideology I've just put on the table, is that centering money and power is ideological, in the sense that the centering of money and power in any given case might be itself just a product, right, of the power relations, right, that the particular constellation of money and power around the agent have done to his views, right? So the distortion of the agent's views by power relations, and so the person has these views about money and power because of the nature of the money and power set up around him. But what I want to talk about is something deeper, and that's the third proposition here, and that is centering money and power in a way that is itself ideological. So let's talk about this. So Russia's transition to capitalism in early 1990s resulted in the production of a kind of gangster-driven capitalist oligarchy, accompanied by an ideological image which said that a sink-or-swim struggle without any social support is not just understandable and, under some circumstances, inevitable byproduct of the way the world goes, but that it is itself actually a normatively impeccable status quo. That is, when you take away all the froth atop a glass, all the bullshit, all the fancy stories we tell ourselves, that's what life is and what life should be. Unbounded, sink-or-swim struggle of all against all. And I call this view hyper-neoliberalism. And neoliberalism isn't a description of a social situation in my books. In my books, neoliberalism is a description of a particular outlook, and that outlook is one that places magical primacy on the market. That's to say, not primacy on the market that is well reasoned and well conceptualized and also evidence-based, but magical primacy magical primacy of the market. When you see in somebody's mind a kind of magical commitment to the market like that, then that's a neoliberal view. In other words, if somebody says, no, let's not nationalize this particular energy company in the UK, and they give good reasons for that, that's not at all a neoliberal position. A neoliberal position is giving primacy to the market in a way that transparently involves some magical thinking. And of course, an important sort of a historical aside here for us all is you don't get the kind of market conditions that neoliberal pictures tend to fancy unless you have a very strong state that produces these markets, right? And that can be paradoxical because all these people don't want a strong state. So it's an important historical aside. So neoliberalism is magical primacy on the market. And hyper-neoliberalism is a term I invented a month ago, unless somebody else has invented it. And by that I mean giving a magical primacy to the market, but understanding primacy of the market in terms of existential struggle, unbounded conflict of all against all, understanding it as I put it here, the idea that might is right. So neoliberalism is magical primacy on the market. Hyper-neoliberalism is magical primacy of the primacy on the market, but primacy on the market conceived as the idea that might's right. Now, Russian political philosopher of the younger generation, Greg Yudin, makes a left-wing argument, which I admire but don't entirely share, which makes a very interesting link. And Greg links the extreme neoliberal character of early 1990s Russian capitalism from the early 1990s, to Putin's limitlessly aggressive foreign policy, via an emphasis on all social and political activity as an existential struggle of all against all. And here, Yudin typically likes to, in a derogatory way, cite Hobbes's image of life as nasty, brutish, and short. And I don't have a problem with that, except that temperamentally, I'm a fan of Hobbes, because Hobbes still gives the most simple and compelling justification of the modern state. And that is to say that its point is to avoid violence. And the reason Hobbes' account of the modern state is in fact entirely modern itself is that Hobbes' empirical judgment that the only way you can achieve that is by an extraordinarily radical kind of authoritarianism. We have just lived enough to see that that's not true. When the weather is good enough, you can achieve that by much more benign means, like Scandinavian social democracy. So we can just reject Hobbes' empirical supplement here, but entirely retain his conceptual picture of the single most important function of the modern state, which is to prevent violence. Now, there is another wider background assumption here, and that is an assumption about the complete separation of the economy from politics. Or rather, the reduction of politics to economic relations and the reduction of economic relations to unbounded struggle. And of course, the complete separation of the economy from politics is itself a deeply political move, contrary to somebody like Mr. Melnichenko, who wants to say that it's apolitical or politically neutral. It's a piece of fanatical political ideology. And you see this also, interestingly, in communism. So that's to say, Russia was the victim, in many ways a self-induced victim, doubly in the 20th century, of an experiment in Western utopia based on extreme economic reductionism. If you get the economy right, everything else follows. That's the idea that constituted the experiment of 1917 onwards. And that's the idea in a very different mode that constituted the experiment of the early 90s. That's to say, in this respect of economic determination over the political, get the economy right and politics follows, Reaganite and Thatcherite views are in the same position as crude Marxist views. It's okay if only 40% of what I've sketched has been well expressed. But what I'm beginning to do here is just put a few brush strokes on the canvas that begin to paint the kind of picture that is Melnichenko's ideological view, while he thinks he doesn't have an ideology. Now, what are learnings here for us? Well, clearly, and we will look at this much more cogently and less abstractly when we look at Putin's ideology in one of the forthcoming videos on the main channel. But clearly, some kind of neoliberal extremism is part of Putin's ideology. In fact, I see Putin's ideology as being constituted of three elements. The F word, mid-20th century F word, the neoliberal element and the mystical element, and they all flow in and out of each other. Mystical elements involve this extraordinary coming together of Putin and the nation in not just in Putin's mind, but in the way the idea of Putin as the only politically legitimate institution in town is dressed up, which is a rather Wagnerian idea of the collective self-realization of a nation being expressed in the will of a single individual. And then this idea of the propulsion of Russia from the back row to the front row of nations in a single swoop, which almost makes it advantageous for Russia to be weak and losing, because it's part of this mystical vision that you need to be weak and losing if you're going to be actually the winner in the end. This mystical picture very interestingly also shows how power can be ideological, right? This is about a certain kind of thirst for power, this sort of rampant propulsion of Russia from the back row to the front row of nations. The fascicized element is clear in Putin's ideology. It begins with the idea that you're doing something truly, truly revolutionary, but also radically conservative at the same time. So anytime you have a somewhat mythical conservative vision tied to revolutionary politics, you're beginning to wander quite deeply already into the landscape of F ideology. So revolutionary social transformation imposed from above to change society so as to bring it to a past that never was. You're already core of the way, half of the way into F ideology. And then there is this neoliberal stuff that, in reference to a more left-wing account of it that I'm bound to accept, is beautifully elaborated by Greg Uden. And I'll link Greg's speculative piece about this below. Now, in milder versions, we have all this stuff here. One of the fascinating things you get out of studying different cultures that are your contemporaries in the world or cultures from the past is that often they have, in a much more extreme form, something that you in a much more minor form have in your society, and you can learn a lot that way. I mean, I'm sitting on an island which just experienced an absolutely bizarre and brief radical neoliberal experiment with the premiership of Liz Truss, who put on the table billions upon billions of pounds of unfunded tax cuts, and was evicted from office, and indeed evicted from her seat in Parliament a couple of days ago. So this is stuff we have here, right? This reduction of politics to economics. Magical thinking about the primacy of the market. But then it's also worth reflecting on just wider forms of reduction we have in Western culture that we can reflect on. Right? It's not just this wildly ideological Russian chap who thinks he is sober and clear. Right? One of the reductions we have in Western culture is scientism. That is to say, reducing everything we want to explain to the extraordinarily marvelous method of explanation of the natural sciences, which absolutely explain the natural world. But they don't necessarily explain why Susan and Harry divorced or why a revolution occurred in Argentina. So, as soon as Brett Weinstein is trying to explain the beginning of the Second World War in reference to his silly cartoons derived from evolutionary psychology, you get that kind of reduction. Final thought. Speaking about Russia, of course, there's this very big irony, which is that in its crude form, Marxism went about eliminating the idea that ideas and ideology are causally significant in history, but it itself became the most causally significant idea in 20th century history. And so what we want to say is that we shouldn't underestimate the power of ideas in radical political projects which claim to be not constituted by ideas at all. And that is very, very important to bear in mind. There's all kinds of political projects that like to think that they're not ideological, that are in fact extremely ideological. And so that's what we have with Mr. Melnichenko. We have extreme forms of ideological commitment to economic determinism of various kinds, extreme views about the separation of politics from economics, and then extreme views not just about the primacy of the market, but the primacy of the market conceived as a conflict of all against all, against which you can't really say anything, because it's not just that it's regrettably true, but in fact it's normatively impeccable, it's the way the world goes. That is a very, 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 very extreme form of ideological reductionism. It is not just a sober guy now on YouTube talking about the world and using his business experience and using his couple of physics degrees or whatever it is he has to soberly and perhaps cynically make sense of the world. No, the power of ideas deeply saturates this man who is profoundly ideologically delusional in a way that is in fact deeply connected to this project about which he is trying to be neutral, which is Putin's project of foreign policy as limitless aggression. Enough. Because I articulate myself so badly, I'm not freaking out if 40% of what I've said has come through. That'll be enough. I hope it gave you a little bit value, and we'll talk in a slightly less alien way next time. Lots of love.